Hello and welcome to Oh What a Lovely podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. Ian Isherwood is joining Chris, Jessica and me today. Ian is Associate Professor of War and Memory Studies at Gettysburg College. His latest book is The Battalion, Citizen Soldiers at War on the Western Front, which follows the 8th Battalion, the Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment from 1914 to the end of the war. It explores how ordinary citizens became soldiers during the First World War, questioning how they coped with the challenges of the Western Front. Thanks for joining us, Ian.
Well, thanks for having me on. I've been a long-time fan of the show.
Oh, that's very flattering of you to say so. I have really enjoyed your book. I have been it's been very unputdownable for me. But I guess our starting point is perhaps to look at how did the Battalion, the book, come about?
So the book came out of a digital history project that we developed at Gettysburg College. And I guess I should maybe rewind a little bit and say that the book really came out of an interaction that I had with a student way back in 2010. I was teaching a survey course called 20th Century World History, and a student came up to me and said, I have my great-grandfather's letters from World War I. And as you know, like when people know that you study World War I, sometimes they bring stuff. And so the student brought me literally a box, a Harrods box that had 300 letters, assorted ephemera, and all kinds of things in it from his great-grandfather, who was the battalion commander of the 8th Queens. So I saw it, and I realized that it was a really rich collection. And over the next few years, I became his academic advisor. I taught him in a number of courses. He wrote a great paper based on his great-grandfather's experiences. And then when he graduated, his family very kindly donated the papers to Gettysburg College so we could create a DH project based on it. And so during the centenary, that's what we did. We created the First World War letters of H.J.C. Peirs. And then from that, the more we started digging and the more archival research I started doing, I realized that there might be an interesting story, not just in Peirs as the commanding officer of the 8th Queens, but in tracing kind of the footsteps of the entire unit. That's kind of how it came about. I'm not sure if it is an interesting story. I think you think it's an interesting story, so that's good. But that's kind of the origin story of how you take a DH project and it becomes eventually a book.
With this focusing on the 8th Battalion of the Queens, very much like a film series, do I need to have read the first 7 to kind of get the narrative arc across it, or does it work as a standalone?
No, it works as a standalone.
Perfect.
That's the American thing of when they did the Madness of George III. Yeah. They thought everybody would think, well, what happened with the Madness of George II?
I think what you do very well with the book actually is it's quite subtle, because it's not quite a unit history and it's not quite a memoir of Peirs, but you very interestingly weave in modern historiography and thinking of the war, which challenges possibly the regular reader of a unit history. Were you consciously doing that? Have you had any resistance from people who've read it and gone, pwah, 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 pwah? Because you constantly just point out that they're not going over the top every day. You know, you point out there's only key moments, and there's a lot of kind of in and out of trenches and moving further and back. Did you find resistance?
So not yet, but I'm sure there will be some. So I think the more people that will read it, the more resistance will come. One of the things that I was kind of very conscious of in writing the book was, first of all, my background is studying mostly people who write war memoirs and trying to understand how you take the experience of war and then how that then becomes a book that's publishable, or a book that someone leaves behind. So I was kind of looking at Peirs's papers from that perspective, kind of looking at it in terms of, well, Peirs never wrote a memoir, but if he wrote a memoir, what would it maybe look like? Or what would a memoir look like if it was written by his officers? And thankfully, one of the key sources within the book is an anonymous regimental history that's in the Surrey History Center. And one of Peirs's officers wrote it. I have speculation about who that officer was, but one of the officers in the battalion wrote that. And it reads a little bit like a unit history, but it also reads a little bit like a memoir. So within the source materials, there was kind of this personal element to it that I was very conscious of. But then the other thing I was conscious of was that I've read a lot of regimental or unit histories, and so I wanted to do something maybe a little bit more edgy or a little more playful with that genre. And I wanted to work in kind of not only to see what they knew at the time and what they were seeing around them, but then trying to get some of the thinking within our field over the last 20 years and work that into it so that we can maybe approach the subject material with kind of a more complicated lens based on the last 100 and so years in which we've been thinking about and writing about the First World War.
Just thinking about that source material, what was actually in Peirs's papers? Because you've clearly done additional research on top of that original source. What sort of materials were in those papers, if not memoirs?
Peirs was a pretty avid correspondent, so he wrote home to both his mother and his father, but he also wrote home to his sisters as well. And, you've all read lots of letter collections, and one of the things that you realize is people were writing different things to different people as they're going along. So the story he's telling his sister is very different than the story he's telling his dad. The story he's telling his dad is different than the story he's telling his mom. So there's a real richness and an emotional complexity that I think you can read between the lines of the correspondence. Peirs's letters first and foremost, but then you also have Peirs saved some things. So he saved some of his trench maps that have his pencil markings on them. So you can see like the direction of attacks, the right flank, left flank. He saved newspaper clippings, some of which irritated him. And there are a few other letters from some of his commanding officer and a few other people. He also had a ton of photographs, and some of the photographs are actually in the book, but the photographs that are in the collection are interesting because there's a lot of glamour shots of Peirs and of himself, shots that are taken by his family. They're clearly very proud of his service. But then he has this collection of photographs that are official photographs taken from the dedication of the 24th Division's memorial in France. And clearly he wanted to hold on to those and wanted to pass those down. So those became an important part of the story too. And then as I started looking more into Peirs and piecing together his life story, our DH team reached out to people at the Charterhouse School Library, reached out to New College Oxford's archive, reached out to and then I spent a lot of time in the National Archives kind of going through as much material as I could related to the unit, to the division, to the two brigades in which they were serving. So kind of using that correspondence then as a basis to kind of blow things up from there.
It's interesting because I've just had a student, you talk about students who's come to me who wants to do their undergraduate dissertation using collection from her, must be now great-grandfather, I think, who's a prisoner of war during the Second World War, which is mainly photographs. But again, it's that really interesting combination of almost tourist shots, but shots of great-grandfather and his comrades themselves, but then also some official propaganda photographs that I don't know how he got hold of them, but it sounds like a very typical collection in some ways as someone who's read a lot of these. So really interesting to think about where you can take that creatively.
When you were talking about the kind of the regimental history that you've and kind of you're speculating about who wrote it, I'm always struck, and I think this kind of ties quite nicely into what you're saying. It's interesting how wildly different even regimental diaries can be, to an extent that it always kind of if you haven't read a lot of them, will surprise people that, sometimes, the idea is, this is going to be a minute by minute account of everything the regiment or the unit was doing. And sometimes it will just be Tuesday, it rained. But then the next book, it'll be written by a different officer and it'll be a 500 paragraph treatise on everyday heroism in the most dire circumstances. We refer to them as official documents, but they're very rarely written in an official language. It wildly depends on who's doing it, how much time they have to do it, which then must provide you, again with the regimental history, with an absolute, potential goldmine or series of incredibly frustrating entries to try and turn into something like this.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I noticed kind of early on. Was I was reading kind of the 8th Queen's war diary, and one of the things I'm very interested in is seeing where the handwriting shifts within the war diary, because that's when the adjutant's gone on leave and then another one's come back in or something like that, right? But especially early on, when they get to France, the adjutant, his name is Peter By, and Peter writes in just this chatty way. It's like he's a tourist arriving in France, and then and then after the battalion goes into combat, the tone immediately changes and it becomes much more official. And so it's interesting to speculate, and I do a little bit of speculation in the book, probably too much of it now that I think about it, but that, and it just kind of demonstrates that most of these officers, like, they don't shed their civilian identities. So they don't know how to write an official war diary entry. Like, they don't know how to be a professional soldier or a professional officer. So they're approaching it as they would a civilian. And then as they get more experienced, that's when I think that the war diary often shifts in that tone and becomes much more boring, I think. But yeah, you can even find a little bit of enjoyment in reading a war diary. I think you're right, Chris.
Is there any evidence of a unit journal? And I just remember sitting with some of the Royal Army Medical Corps, some of the field ambulance journals, which are almost impenetrable because they're almost all in jokes. And you're going, that would have been really funny if you'd been there, but not so much 100 years later on.
Yeah, so there's not with the Eighth Queens, but we have surviving some of their like mess dinner menus, which are full of all of these puns that unless you're in the unit, you really don't get. But they're also in the 24th Division, which is the division in which the Wipers Times comes out of. And we know that Peirs actually published a poem in the BEF Times. It's called The Sapper. It's not very good. But he took his hand at being a war poet because who didn't?
There's some fantastically bad poetry out there. There really is.
As this was a digital project, did you have a website and you were updating it continually as you were working on it?
So we created the website, www.jackpeirs.org. We decided right from the start that we wanted student workers on it, that we would pay them essentially to learn how to do DH. So we brought students on immediately. Our students did a lot of the transcription, eventually wrote some commentary, eventually worked on mapping content. So we updated the website for every letter that Peirs published. We published 100 years to the day in which he wrote the letter. And then with our Twitter account and our Instagram account and our Facebook account, we updated updates from the Western Front just as Peirs was actually writing these letters home. So that was kind of our gimmick that we started with. We haven't updated the site that much because we ran out of letters, but we still have some relatively fresher content in the last few years that we've put up.
But with it being public facing like that, did you find that people were discovering the website and sending you new material?
Yes. Yeah, and I had several people whose ancestors were in the Eighth Queens reach out to me, including their first commanding officer's family, the Fairglow family, who reached out to me as well. So that was one of the more touching aspects of working on it, was that people were actually kind of supporting our project and sending us things, and that became a part of the story too.
Did you run into any sort of ethical issues? And I say this as someone who got involved in a family row where one family member was very happy for me to use their ancestors' letters and another one was very much not.
So not yet. Most of the people that reached out to us were very supportive, and we'd already put material up from them. And I think a lot of people were just happy that we were telling the stories of people that have been forgotten. And since most of the book is about Peirs and most of our focus has been on Peirs, we've had the support of his family. And that's been kind of essential to us, that they basically told us from day one they wanted this material to be used, that people could learn from it, and for our students to work with it.
It's always an interesting thing when you're taking that, you were talking about sort of bringing in all the research, the academic scholarship, the critical research that's been done to telling these stories, that to make them a little bit unfamiliar perhaps. And it's always interesting doing that with people's family myths, having worked on Anthony Fletcher's family papers on the Reggie Trench papers while they were still in private hands. I just remember having a sense of, well, how far can I go with this before, this is someone I know and who I have coffee with, whose grandfather I'm talking about.
That's something you always have to have in your mind. And Jessica, especially with what you work on with a lot of medical history, I mean, there's a lot of sensitive material.
That was the ethical issue around why the Men, Women and Care project was never a digital project, never a digital humanities project in quite the way the Peirs papers were, because we couldn't put medical information in the public domain in that way. And there was a digital humanities project at Laurier working on the Canadian equivalent, which is a much smaller collection of pension records. But having digitized everything, they then sort of went, we're going to have to redact all of this, and ended up having to spend almost as much money redacting the medical information as they had done to digitize. So we got to learn from their experience.
At the various stages in which you've been kind of utilising the Peirs paper, so it started as like the digital history project and that expanded and then it kind of moves into the book. Did you have like a kind of, I don't know, like a hierarchy of audiences in mind? Did it start off, this is going to be for students and then it's going to be for the public and then, the book is presumably kind of for a popular audience and did that inform the way that you approached things? Because basically if you're kind of going, obviously an academic audience exists, but that's not necessarily who we're aiming at for this.
So one of the great things about our team, which is primarily myself, Amy Lucadamo, and R.C. Meisler, within a bunch of student research assistants who've worked on it over the years. We've kind of made things up as we've gone along because we were all kind of new to DH as we started doing it. And then, what started off as kind of a gimmicky thing eventually evolved into a website that we were putting an awful lot of time and thought into what we were trying to do and what we were trying to convey to an audience that we were pretty convinced was going to be pretty much First World War buffs, mostly in the UK. So that was the audience that we knew we were kind of playing with. But then we also knew that we could get some Americans interested in the material through teaching and using the material, for me assigning the materials to students to work on, and then through our student assistants who were being trained with using the materials too. So I think we broadened the audience out a little bit more than we thought we would. And then actually Amy, RC, and I just published a chapter in a Routledge companion to DH on the Peirs project. So when we started it, we didn't think we'd write an academic chapter based on our experiences, but over time, we learned an awful lot in working on the project, mostly about what not to do, as well as kind of what to do. That's kind of how these projects work. I think the key thing is that, I had a really creative team. We tried to not have any hierarchy amongst ourselves with our students too, and that meant we could be as playful as we wanted.
With the chapter, it also kind of proves the truism that you can't do anything in academia without at some point turning into something that you write about, whether you want it to or not.
I'm intrigued by what not to do. What did you learn what not to do with the digital project?
Well, we learned not to put ourselves as much into the project, so not to do a ton of videos that were self-indulgent and things like that. The people honestly just wanted to hear about the 8th Battalion or about Peirs and about the history. So we didn't make it not entertaining, but we didn't. But at the same time, we kept our focus pretty tightly on the source material.
Does that mean the audience is more willing to go further to read the history rather than be entertained?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that the closest we got to entertainment value, if you can say that, is when we went over for the anniversary of the Kaiserschlacht. So we went over on March 21st and did some real-time, what we called battlefield to battlefield broadcasting on Facebook Live in 2018, the exact positions that the 8th Queens were in when they were fighting in La Verdier, France. And when we say battlefield to battlefield, I was broadcasting these little battlefield tour snippets back to Gettysburg College, which is on a Civil War battlefield. So that was kind of our battlefield to battlefield gimmick in which we were doing.
So how much did those sort of creative takes on the history and the connections that you can see as a historian, how much did those end up in the book, would you say?
It definitely is a part of the book. I mean, one of the things that when we're talking about genre with the book, what Angus was talking about earlier, one of the confusing aspects for me was that as I was writing the book, I was developing as a historian. So I was developing my own skills. I was learning new things. I mean, I'm not a true drums and bugles kind of military historian. But
I don't think anybody is in this room.
Right. But I had to read an awful lot of military history, and I had to figure out what's actually going on and at the brigade, at the division level, what's actually how these battalions and these brigades are functioning. The good thing is I felt like a civilian trying to figure this out, and I think a lot of the officers in the 8th Queens felt that way as they were going through their experiences. But so part of the book is, of course, charting my own development as a historian and learning how to write history in a different way.
I was going to say that I think your point about that kind of the lessons that you learned about the digital history part about, people are there for the content rather than necessarily the kind of the the editorializing voice or the kind of the entertainment factor is firstly a kind of quite a useful one, because I think there's a tendency within us as historians, particularly when every letter and every diary, like from the first report, is different in its own ways. But you reach a point where you've read so many of them, you start to wonder whether or not you're showing anybody anything new. But that's because we've read so many of them. Whereas it is new for a wider popular audience, and they don't necessarily need someone kind of appearing in between them and the material in that way.
Yeah, and I think that I run into this every semester when I teach with the Peirs letters, because a lot of my students, like, I take for granted the fact that they don't spend their lives going through other people's mail. And so when they start to read the letters, they're like, they don't need me to tell them that this is a really interesting anecdote within the letters. Like, they're able to discover that firsthand. And when they come to class and they're like, why is this guy fretting so much about his cigars, or fretting so much about this cat that's in the dugout with him? Like, what they're noticing is the human connection within the letters. And that's what made the collection really rich the first time that I read through them. Was I realized that Peirs was a really sarcastic, chatty officer. He certainly loved his creature comforts, and he writes home about these things. He isn't just telling people it's raining outside, it's muddy, he's a bit gossipy.
I suspect we all have our favorite,
Yeah.
letter collections out there for exactly those reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But Jimmy's a demonstration that life goes on. It's not all the war, although the war is all encompassing for him. It's not all encompassing for him because he's got other things to think about as well, which I think is an interesting point as a civilian soldier.
Yeah, he does, and and what he's not writing home is just as interesting. And that's where the war diary and the other materials come into play. One of the things we realized, I think I realized this pretty late. I think it was in 2018, so we were almost out of letters. And I realized a pattern where it was right before it was his letter from March 21st. So he writes home to his mother March 21st, 1918. And the context of the letter is interesting because he's under bombardment. So the great German spring offensive has begun, and he's having all of these shells that are dropped all around him. And he writes a quick 1-paragraph letter to his mother, basically saying he might have to go up the line later. And it's one of these things that I looked at that letter and I'm like, he was writing that almost certainly when he's under attack. And of course, doesn't say anything. There's no military information in there. So I went back and I looked at his other attacks, and sure enough, he writes his mother right before he goes into action. Just a quick letter, usually doesn't say anything about going into action, or he writes her immediately when he's coming out. So when you start to look at the overall context, you realize, wow, there's actually a really rich story here in what he's not saying and what's actually going around. And the things that he is writing home about compared to then, like when he writes home and he asks his dad to go get him a new raincoat. Well, that's because he loses his raincoat in no man's land in the attack at Luz. But he doesn't, of course, say to his family, I was under machine gun fire and left my raincoat behind.
I remember, I think one of the first times I kind of encountered you talking about the Peirs was at the Craig Lockhart conference, which was at some point in the before times. And I remember you talking about those letters that he was writing at the beginning of the German Spring Offensive. And I got this memory of you talking about as well that when he was writing to his mother, he was saying, the weather is very sunny and it's all very fine. It's like, well, the weather absolutely was not sunny and fine on the 21st of March, 1918. And I remember us having a conversation about, the possibility that he's writing in code, that, in some way he's trying to impart information to his parents in a not distressing manner about what is probably about to happen.
Yeah, that was a conversation that I ended up thinking an awful lot about because I just started writing the book too. And I was thinking to myself, if he's writing these letters in code, I've got the whole story wrong. And I think we were talking to Alex Mayhew about this too. I think it was the three of us.
Yeah, I think so.
And, I think he's not. I mean, but there's no way to really know. But I think he's actually writing to comfort her.
Yeah, sunny sounds better than raining, and definitely sounds better than artillery shells.
It's back to that what is left out, because it's a point that I make in Men of War that, in the letters, particularly when they're writing to their mothers, but it's true when they're writing to their families in general. Even when they do talk about things, they're always at a distance. It's always using familiar language, that everything's sunny, they have enough food. If difficulties, it's a funny anecdote about having to use cold tea to shave or whatever it is. Audience is important.
And Jessica, to that point, I mean, there was when the Eighth Queens comes under their first gas attack, Peirs writes home to his mother because he knows she's going to probably read about this in the papers. But he writes home and he makes a joke out of it where he says, you would just laugh at these men with their gas masks on. They're walking around and they look like ducks, right? He doesn't say we took 120 casualties. He says how funny it is to see the men in their PH helmets.
Or how actually eerie. You look at the photographs of men in PH helmets, you think, funny, you'd laugh.
Right.
You mentioned you went back to France and did those live pieces. I wonder how much of a residual memory in France there is of the regiment, because the regiment did put a monument in the village, didn't they? That they were, I've forgotten the name of the village. You'll have to remind me the name of the village.
Yeah, so it's Le Verrier, and it's like smack in the middle of the Kaiserschlacht. Like it's right in the middle of where the major German attack was. And the Eighth Queens fought a 22-hour holding action there. And the unit very much saw that as kind of their most triumphant moment within the entire war. Later on, veterans had plaques made up that said Le Verrier on them. At the very center of their battle honors. So it became a real point of pride that they held their position while other units were collapsing around them. I kind of see it as, it's a bit of a mixed bag in the way that I've interpreted it within the book, because although, they did succeed in holding the town eventually fell, and then they end up having to fight a rearguard action for a week afterward. And it's an incredibly bloody engagement. So it's very much a mixed bag, but when they go back and they dedicate the memorial, so they put up a new belfry and they actually built a school and a municipal building within the town. So they helped to rebuild the town itself. And there's still a monument on the belfry that's there. But one of the things that we discovered in 2018 is we made contact with the mayor and the deputy mayor. It's a very small town, but the deputy mayor called the local paper that came out. They did a little story about us, but then we started collecting more people in the village as we started walking around. So we ended up having this group of about 10 or 15 people within the village who were walking around with us as we were looking for particular sites. And some of them brought some things out for us that they had dug up in their garden, or things that they that had been a part of their family's history. So photographs of family members that are like playing in shell holes and things like that. And so they brought out all of this material for us. And it was really quite touching because, we got to the village and the mayor put out the tricolor on the war memorial. All of these people were telling us their stories. We were trying to kind of understand that there was a legacy there. I mean, the town was absolutely wrecked in the First World War, but they rebuilt it. And, their civilian experiences were certainly a part of it. And so that was a really touching aspect. And Jessica, one of the artifacts that somebody dug up was a clay pipe with the insignia, the cap badge carved into it of the RAMC.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, and the place where he found it is where there was an aid station in the 1918 battle. So I thought this was just amazing.
Time for a smoke, even in the midst of battle.
That's right.
Had the village kept connections with the regiment over the last 100 years?
So I don't think so. And I think that there had been other people who had come back and had been interested. I think there was somebody who was interested, and I forget who it was. And I think it was a WFA person who was interested years ago in writing a history of the 24th Division because they don't have one. But, I think they're not necessarily used to battlefield tourists walking around because it's a very remote location and very small part of a much bigger battle. But it has occasionally happened.
It's interesting though that the men pay for the belfry. There's a collection for the belfry and the memorial, yet they haven't twinned the towns or anything like that with the locality in Britain.
Yeah, I find that interesting too.
To what extent does the book talk about the battalion and if you're talking about these men as citizen soldiers, men who were civilians who become soldiers in war, do you talk about what happens to them afterwards and the men who survived?
I've been thinking a lot about that subject because that's a big part of the story that I didn't uncover as much of it as I would like to. By keeping the focus a bit more narrowly on somebody like Peirs and and a small group of officers. I tease out a little bit about what happens to them afterward. But I think that it's one of these areas of our field that I want to see a lot more research done. And I know you're working on something related to this, Jessica.
Yeah, that's my next book. So that's why I'm asking the question.
Right. And it's actually kind of funny because I was thinking of a project like this a few years ago. And then I said to myself, this is a really great story, but it could be a really depressing story. And, do I want to spend the next 10 years or something like that focusing on kind of the post-war lives when a lot of those post-war lives are it's pretty bleak reading, right?
Well, but it's interesting though, because if you look at Mike Roper's new book on Descendants, which is, he's coming at it from the other direction, oral histories of the children of these men who survived. It's actually not that depressing. I think that was what I really loved about that book. The vast majority of men, they go back. Yes, they were soldiers for that tiny period of time, but they stay civilians throughout that. They weave their war experience into their lives. They, even when it does affect their lives after, it's not their whole life. And they live full, rich lives, many of them. And yes, there are depressing elements to all of that.
I was about to say, for those following along at home who don't understand academic parlance, it's not that depressing is not the same as it isn't depressing.
But so there's a lovely photograph of in Afterlives, which, and this is my abiding memory of reading the book, is this photograph of an ex-serviceman with his two children on a beach. Mm-hmm. There's nothing depressing about that.
And there's so much to that. And, in this book, I do try to end it on a high note by talking about remembrance and the fact that they're having reunions afterward. And then ending it with Peirs' story. I mean, Peirs goes on and he has a family and very much is a very successful kind of upper middle class solicitor with a whole career and a partial life ahead of him. He dies a little bit youngish, but he dies in his early 50s. But he does have a family, and he does have a rich life afterward. One of the other characters in the book, Edward Abdy Fellows, ends up becoming the clerk of the House of Commons. And one of the anecdotes that I love is that he, during the Second World War, he's actually in command of the House of Parliament Home Guard. He's out there drilling members of Parliament in the Home Guard. And, and clearly his previous service, was something he's very proud of. And I think that they were, but it wasn't their whole lives.
Yeah.
I'd watch that version of Dad's Army.
There's a wonderful bit. I know in one of his final letters to I think it's his father, you just say, he writes, well, so that's that. And I thought, well, that's an interesting sort of phraseology. Well, I've finished that bit and moved on, which curiously reminded me of the end of, I think, Lord of the Rings, where Sam comes back and he says, well, I'm back. It's kind of an underwhelming sort of statement of the end. I've finished that bit and I'm now moving on.
Is that Tolkien then reflecting on his war service?
Yeah.
The corpse of Tolkien's eyes are glowing with anger right now at being connected to the First World War.
Well, we have Tolkien's service pistol in special collections.
Oh, yeah. But he used to go absolutely mad when anybody tried to suggest that Lord of the Rings was in any way reflective of the First World War.
Chris, it's not an allegory.
No. Stop trying to suggest it is.
Well, to that point, so one of my nerdy interests is I teach a class, and Tolkien would hate this. I teach a class at Gettysburg on Tolkien and Lewis and the First World War, basically, which, Lewis would be fine with, I think, but Tolkien would absolutely hate that. So I teach the class that attracts just mostly Lord of the Rings fans, right? But one of the anecdotes that we talk about, and it's something that I'm doing a little bit of research on right now, is that Lewis and Tolkien used to go on these walking holidays. So they'd go with each other, and they would go with other veterans of the First World War, like Owen Barfield and their friends at Oxford. But they were all vets, and they'd go on these walking holidays. And so they put on a rucksack, and they go from pub to pub. And I think about that because they're obviously they were veterans. They all marched together. They drilled together. There's a definite connection between veteranhood, but there's also kind of a rekindling of comradeship that I think is involved in something like that.
I might have your next project for you, which is on 1920s and 30s rambling in the First World War. I was at a conference in memory of a former colleague of mine, the late, great Malcolm Chase, on the Radical North a couple of weeks ago. And one of the papers was on a couple of northern radical working men's groups and leisure pursuits, which included and that sort of community and comradeship around that. One of the bits of evidence that the speaker, the period covered sort of 1890 to 1930, but one of the bits of evidence was a collection that one of these groups had put together of songs for singing while walking that was published in 1922. So I need to now go over to the John Rylands Library and take a look at this, because I'm pretty sure it was veterans who were part of those walking groups.
That's a great project.
I also think you could quite easily rebrand like the walking tours that C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien did, and take people on the walking tours that C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien did. Although obviously with the kind of the Lord of the Rings fans taking the course, I mean, honestly, can you imagine taking your geeky interests and trying to turn it into some form of serious history? It sounds ridiculous.
So my son went to a friend's birthday party a couple of weeks ago, which is a ghost tour of Haworth. That was it. I was trying to remember which Yorkshire village. It was a ghost tour. But they were all encouraged to dress up. So can you imagine the Lord of the Rings walking tour with everybody dressing up?
Sounds great. The same day at Comic-Con, you'll be fine.
Yeah, it's just some strange laugh.
So what's is there a plan for next, Ian? I mean, we've joked about it a little bit, or is it kind of a case of I've just written a book, I'm going to rest, recover and demobilize?
Well, so I just finished a piece with Steve Trout. Steve's a literary scholar, First World War literary scholar, and we just wrote a piece that you might be interested in. I think Jessica especially might be interested in.
I think I know what this is. I'm pretty sure we want to bring you back on to talk about this.
Yeah, so we just wrote a piece on the 50th anniversary of the Great War in Modern Memory for the Journal of Military History. So it'll be out, I think, in their January issue. So it's going to be out relatively quickly.
That's one for next year's reading list on my Culture of Modern War.
I think that's an episode for next year as well.
Yeah, Steve and I had a lot of fun with it because it's a book that people love or love to hate, and so we just wanted to speculate on why we think that. So you'll have to read the piece, but we'll speculate on why we think it's lasted as long as it has and been as important.
I had one student who grappled with it in their essay this year. Did a pretty good job of it as well, actually.
So we just finished that, and I'm writing, in theory, a book on American war memory from the Civil War to the global war on terror. When I say in theory, I'm struggling with it. It's a big.
There's quite a lot there.
Yeah, there's too much. So, so it's going to take me a while, but I'm working on that, and then
this is for any of our listeners who think that all we talk about is the First World War.
Yeah, and I haven't even mentioned Star Wars.
Yeah, Chris, come on.
Well, we have to get it all cleared through Lucasfilm now, so it creates a backlog.
But yeah, so I'm working on that, and then I have a small side project on C.S. Lewis that now is going to become a walking holiday project.
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. Sounds great.
Well, but among other things, it's going to bring you over to because while we're speaking to you, you are actually in the UK, which means that we're doing this at a sensible time.
Yeah, it's been great. So I've been in Lancaster all semester with 17 students from Gettysburg College. So it's been fun.
And any reason to get you back would be good.
So if that is us about done, do we know where we're going next time out, Chris?
I can't remember. But obviously, as we're doing this in 2025, and the world looks a very different place now that we're all on the moon, so it could be literally anything.
Could I just point out, as I think I'd floated the idea of Sapphire and Steel, which is sort of this assignment 2, ITV must have been listening because they've now put it on their Watch Again website. Haunted villages, seances, First World War ghosts. What's not like?
To give away where we are in the year, I have noted that Creepy Christmas seems to be the theme of 2024. So we can pick it up and run with it into 2025.
What are you talking about? We're in 2025 right now.
Good. Well, we don't have anything else. I guess all the best for 2025 for everybody.
Yes. Happy New Year that's already happened.
Thanks for having me on.
Oh, absolute pleasure.
Oh, it's a lovely war. Oh, we won't be thinks and hands when we got plum and